Okay, so today what we're going to do is we are taking our compositions and we're adding in a fifth color. Okay, so you can see I've got a range of colors here. I've gone for kind of in a similar way to the previous. I've gone for 4 colors that are kind of quite similar. There's one you'll notice who sort of sits out a little bit from the other 3, but it's still in a kind of similar color group. And then I've got my standalone. Okay, so you can imagine which of the elements of the composition I'm going to use for this. Probably not the background. Okay, probably not the background accent or the second background. Probably not the rhythm. Although you could maybe think about using it as rhythm and maybe this as focal point, because we've got a contrast of lightness with this yellow color. Okay, so we'll think about that, but for now I'm just really thinking about collecting up colors that I feel are going to work in a good way together. I'm thinking when I collect my colors a little bit about that background atmosphere, the focal point, the star of the show, and I'm thinking about my rhythm, the repeated element that pulls me through my eye, through the composition. So I've gone for these ones, and I am going to kind of think primarily about those as being kind of my more harmonious colors, and these as kind of being my 2 slightly more bold colors, more contrasting colors. So just like before, I want to think about my background. So it might be interesting with this to think about what my 2 background colors are going to be. Remember, there's only going to be really 2 colors in your background. Today, what we're thinking about is either making a main focal point with a kind of supporting focal point, or maybe we're thinking about creating a focal point and instead of 1 rhythm, 2 rhythms. 2 rhythms is easier, right, than 2 focal points. Okay, say that again. 2 rhythm accents are easier than balancing out 2 focal points, which might end up fighting with each other. It really depends on the color and the sort of contrast you get with that focal point. I'll show you what I mean. So for me, I've decided I'm going to go for a main background color and a secondary background color that look like this. Just like before, we want to think about that being quite a nice big coverage with our accent. And for me, I'm going to do something wiggly, I think, this time. So again, I could just put that in. That's an option. I could even put those back in if I wanted to, all 3, and have the split. Remember, it doesn't have to be a perfect rectangle, so that's an option. I might just choose to keep 1. So maybe I do something a bit like that. Kind of creates quite a nice flow in the composition. So at the moment, I'm kind of, just see what that looks like. Yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards maybe something like that. Maybe that kind of twisted looks quite interesting. I can change my mind. No big deal. So I've made a fairly quick decision, kind of going with my gut. Now I need to think about my focal point. So this is definitely the big standout color. So regardless of whether or not I decide to do 2 rhythms or whether or not I decide to do 2 focal points, this is definitely going to be the strongest, most standout color. And whenever we have a focal point, we want it to be quite isolated, so on its own, quite unique to the other shapes, quite strong in terms of its size, and really contrasting in terms of its color. That is going to give you the best focal point. So I am going to go for, I've got this curvy shape. I've done a spiky shape before. I'm going to go for something quite, I don't know. I'm going to go for quite geometric sort of shape. Best not to make it too small. Go for something like that. Remember, we're not making a picture that looks like something in the real world. So I could play around with that. Think about maybe that's focal point. Could go here. It's kind of nice to have that kind of upright element. Could it go that way? Quite sort of like that with the pink so coming behind both sides. We don't necessarily want it to be dead center, remember? Dead center is a bit too obvious. too easy to look at. It's nice for our brains like things that are just a little bit not quite right, a little bit off what you're expecting. So I quite like that at the moment. I might change the shape of this in a bit. Let's just see how we go. So I've done that. I then want to think about, am I going to go for a secondary, sort of second focal point? So another focal point, which isn't quite as strong as this, but maybe draws my eye to this point here. Again, it would just be usually one thing on its own. So I'm kind of thinking about that. Let's give that a try first, because we know that's our more challenging thing we can do. So why don't we give that a try first? Because we like challenging ourselves. So I might, with a second focal point, we always want it to be usually underneath the main focal point. So it's kind of almost in a way kind of framing or highlighting that area by using that. Quite like that. It's working quite well. If I could have it sitting on top, perhaps, but with that particular shape, that might be a bit trickier because it doesn't really want to sit nicely with those other shapes. I could change the size of it, perhaps. I do quite like it sort of sitting behind that point. Really draws my eye to that point. And that's working quite nicely. So for the moment, I'm actually pretty happy with the idea of having a main focal point and a kind of supporting or secondary focal point. And that just leaves me my rhythm, so my repetition. So I want to think about this one being something that has, instead of like my focal point just on its own, these are like almost like our backing singers, our vocal supporting. If you were thinking about a piece of music, these would be the line of people in the background, the chorus perhaps singing alongside the main lead singer. So I can bring my repetition in. I have to think about the size of this repetition. Like, is this a good scale? You know, these are all quite large elements. We don't want them all to be the same size. You should want to have a nice variety in there. I could put a fourth one in, and that would actually be okay. But generally, we like odd numbers with our composition elements. It works best to have odd numbers. The brain, again, doesn't feel that satisfying evenness, so it makes it more interested in wanting to look. And again, I'm kind of using with this, I could point them all to my focal point and my secondary focal point. We've done that before. But for this one, it feels almost a bit too obvious. And I quite like this line that I'm getting here. So when I put these in that direction, actually what I'm getting is lots of those diagonal lines, which is kind of helping structure the composition. And it is still moving my eye through the composition, because they're moving me almost like a flowing river through the composition this way. So that would work quite nicely. Now, just for the sake of argument, remember, in case you're thinking like, oh, I don't know if I can balance a main focal point with another focal point. That might be a bit too confusing. I'm not sure I can do that. Okay, so let's think, if we didn't want to do that, slightly easier option, if you're finding that hard, you've got your lead singer, you've got your background singers, you've got the background effect, the kind of like bass line of your music, making that atmosphere. I could instead think about creating some rhythm with my yellow. We would definitely not want that rhythm to be the same size as the rhythm of the orange. So for this one, I'm still going to go with that pointy shape. And some of you are thinking, well, miss, your pointy shape is also in your focal point. That's true. Maybe that's what I could do better. You know, that's an ABI for me, is thinking about a way of creating a bit more of contrast in the shape of my focal point. Maybe I could think about that now and change this to maybe something that has a stronger, maybe a more complex detail in it. So remember, I had a minute ago, I had 4 of those yellows, and I really want odd numbers. I want them to be small, and I don't want them just to be 3 because that's not very many. So I've gone for 5. You can even go up to 7, you know, depends on the scale of them. And here again, I want to try, maybe I'm just thinking about how I use them in a different way to the other rhythm. So this rhythm was sort of sectioning my piece up, and it was also creating this strong diagonal line. It's almost like a kind of river snaking. These are more almost like little waypoints or markers. I'm using them more as a sort of stopping point rather than flowing point. And my eyes moving through. Is this one too close to the other one? Would it be better maybe sort of more in that middle bit? I can sort of think what I think about that. Kind of like these around the outside. I feel like they start to create more of a, rather than jutting through like these orange pieces, these yellow ones are kind of more encircling, enclosing, and framing in a more circular motion, this outside bit. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that one. Now, you'll probably notice this took a little bit longer than using just 4 colors because I had to decide what sort of approach I was going to take. Was I going to go for a main focal point with a supporting focal point? Remember this guy? Or was I going to go for a 2 rhythm combination where I've got 2 different types of rhythm doing 2 different jobs around the outside, both repeating? That was something for me to consider, and I'm glad that I tried both. In the end, you know, I actually think I prefer this one. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, what if I think it would be best maybe if I put both, use that yellow, what if I tried to use it for both? A secondary background, a secondary focal point, I should say. A secondary focal point and rhythm. You can see the only sort of issue with that really is that it's no longer doing the same job of highlighting that focal point. If I just take those away for a second so you can see how that really, really draws my eye in. I was looking at that. So you might have a feel about what sort of works best for you in terms of the decision about where you use that 5th color. A secondary or supporting focal point? Or, so this is like a duet, isn't it? We think about that kind of, that musical reference. This is like a duet. This is maybe the lead singer, and this is the sort of accompanying vocalist on lead as well. They're doing a duet together. Or you're going to have a bigger chorus of background singers supporting in the background of that piece, helping us pull around this way. The choice is yours. Once you've done one of those, folks, what I want you to then do is, again, you've got all these extra bits of paper left over. Try and see if you can make another combination. You know, even better in some respects, if you could try maybe really push the boat out in terms of your combos here. So that might be my background, my main background effect. I might think about then using, again, this is a focal point. And, oh, I'm missing my red, aren't I? I'm going to need another color. So I'm going to need to then think about, this might be my rhythm element or my secondary focal point in there, but I'm definitely going to need another color because I need to have 5. So you'll need to go up and get another piece. But can you recycle these? Maybe can you try another color added into these in order to change up the effect a little bit? Maybe instead of going for a red with these leftovers, I might choose a blue so that my green has, or a light blue, so it's kind of closer to this tone with a light blue, not as strong a darkness as this green, but yet it is kind of blending in a little bit more with my green. So there's a lot of color choices you could play around with, really take some risks on the second one. And then just the same as last time, the last thing I want you to do is, once you've got at least one in there, depending on time, it would be amazing to see you do your www EBI. Again, we're thinking about how well you use the composition elements. Okay, so for example, is your focal point working? Can you see your focal point clearly? What sort of background effect did you try and go for? How have you used your color combinations? How have you used shape to create contrast? Once you've thought about those three as strengths, what can you think about those three in terms of areas to improve? So remember, I said I could create maybe a more complex focal point. Because it's quite similar. Always see if you can use the word because it tells me why. Because it is quite similar to my rhythm at the moment. I might think about my color combination in here. Perhaps I could have used a cooler color, maybe blue instead of green for the focal point. Now that wouldn't have clashed as much with the red, but it certainly would have sparked off a contrast, a complementary contrast with my yellows and my oranges. So consider a cooler color for the focal point. And maybe when I do my second version, I might actually reflect on some of these and think about, actually, could I bring some of those points from my even better ifs and actually use them in my second version. So have a go with that, guys, to make your complex compositions using either a main focal point with a supporting focal point or a secondary focal point, or two rhythms, as you can see in this example. But remember, the two rhythms are different, not just different colors, but different shapes, different sizes, and they have different role to play. Okay, and I can't wait to see what you do.